Hi, this is Module 2, Lecture 4 for Introduction to International Relations. In this lecture, what we're going to do is do a deep dive into the concept of realism to continue on with the theme for this second module. So we've already learned about how realism in general compares to other theories like liberalism and constructivism, but now we're going to take apart realism in two of its more contemporary variants to discuss the differences between these kinds of subtheories. So one that you are now familiar with from having read for this module is classical realism. And for classical realists, they take, again, to echo from last lecture, a very pessimistic view of human nature, right? Humans are naturally or inherently bad. States are primarily interested in power above all else, and prudence or cautiousness trumps morality. So we should be cautious, but we shouldn't let that dictate our we should let that dictate our actions more so than the morals or ethics of the international system that we hold. This contrasts with a more recent variant of realism called structural or neo-realism. Neo for new and structural because, as you can see from the first point, structural realists pay a great deal of attention to and emphasize heavily on the structure of the international system and how that is actually what's really important in driving state behavior. So again, the first point here is that the structure of the international system, not human nature, is what impacts and directs state behavior. And so what do we mean by structure? Well, basically, structure refers to the separation of powers within the international system. So how many different most powerful states are there? Is there one? Are there two? How does the presence of one or more global hegemons or leaders of the world that dominate the international system, how does that affect what they do and how does that affect what other states will do? So that's what we mean when we say the structure of the international system. Second, this is a slight change from classical realism, but neo-realists believe that states are primarily interested in survival. So this is important because it suggests that power is only a means to an end, that end being survival. If you can't survive, what's the point of being powerful? Your state is, completely obliterated. So that's a slight difference from the classical realist view. And then, again, to reflect the first point here and the name itself, prudence or the cautiousness with which states conduct themselves in the international system should be dictated by structure, which means that once you have a handle on who are the major actors in the international system, that helps you to understand how you should act. Under what circumstances should you tend to be more cautious? When can you be a little bit more adventurous in your dealings with other states? And so here, again, the emphasis is really on who are the most important actors and what is the position of a state compared to those most important actors or those most powerful actors. Now, given that these are theories that they don't allege to explain absolutely everything, I want you to take a moment and think to yourself if there's any problem with any of these theories. Are there things that the scholars, we have here sort of the classical realism branch represented by Hans Morgenthau, and then you have the structural or neo-realist branch that is represented by the work of John Mearsheimer. Are there anything that they might have left out of the equation in trying to understand how states behave? And you can think back to the last lecture when we talked about the differences between, say, idealism and realism, and some of the aspects that idealism brings to the table are very different than the kinds of things that, say, a structural realist might be interested in. So is it the case, for example, that all humans are naturally bad, right? That's what we learned from the last lecture. That's reflected here in classical realism. Or is it that structure alone, or at least more so than human nature, directs state behavior? So if we know that the United States is the most powerful government in the world, is that the only or major consideration that a state has to think about when it's deciding to take a certain action that might impact the United States or its allies? And another thing that's important to consider, especially when we get to talking about constructivism, and we did talk about this a little bit when we looked at idealism, this idea of morality being important. For the structural or neo-realists, they think that, largely speaking, morality, not really that important. Our decisions are guided by the structure of the international system. But are there times that you can think about where countries have undertaken an action that might have been very costly, that might have not seemed on its face to be very valuable in the short term, but it was something that was important in terms of stating their ethical position on an issue? I mean, one thing that comes to mind is the fact that the United Kingdom was a major promoter of ending the abolition movement or ending the slave trade. That could have been very costly, given that they were getting free labor, but the people who spearheaded that effort from the United Kingdom viewed it as a moral and ethical issue. So it was not the same thing as thinking about whether this is going to put the United Kingdom at a competitive disadvantage compared to the United States. It was the right thing to do for the abolitionist movement. And do you agree or disagree with these assumptions? Do you think, for example, that all humans at base are bad by their very nature? Or is it more like the idealist conception that there's room to believe that most humans are in fact good and will do good things as their kind of default position, and that the times in which humans have done awful things are really meant to signify the deviations from the norm? Is it that to go on to the second point for both of these variants of realism, is it that states are primarily interested in power, primarily interested in survival? One thing that you might think about are the differences among different kinds of states. So especially structural realists are very adamant that a lot of these rules apply to what they call the great powers, not necessarily every country. So if we're thinking about small island states, like those in the South Pacific, Vanuatu, Kiribati, the kinds of things that they might be interested in, like say for the impact that climate change is going to have on survival, that may make those kinds of countries more likely to engage in cooperative behavior if they think that it will contribute to their survival from an existential standpoint. But they're probably not going to be investing heavily in their military in order to reap the same benefits so that they can survive in the international system. For some countries, environmental concerns are much more front and center than militaristic ones. So are we okay with the idea that these rules don't really apply to all countries across all time periods, but generally speaking, the realists argue apply to the great powers throughout most of modern state history? So what are some of the principles of the international system that are important to understand if we're going to have a discussion about how these theories work or don't work to explain state behavior? And we've already covered a couple of these, but suffice it to say, it's always important to revisit them so that we can make sure we have a full grasp of the concepts as we go to talk about them further. So I mentioned anarchy last time, and again, here, anarchy is not meant to signify chaos in the international system, but rather lack of a supreme authority or central authority in the international system. And this means that there's a great deal of emphasis on self-help. So you have to do what's in your own best interest. You cannot simply rely on the goodwill of other states, and that kind of dovetails with the notion that humans are inherently bad, because if you believe that other states are out to get you all the time, then it means you really have only yourself to count on. So that's what a world in which anarchy exists, and anarchy comes to denote the international system. That's what it means practically speaking, that you basically can't count on anyone else but yourself. Another concept which relates more to constructivism and a little bit to idealism as well, certainly these are things that realists don't find as much value in, is the concept of norms. And norms are shared expectations regarding proper behavior. And so at the individual level, you might think of norms that we experience every day. So, for example, when someone is exiting a door, you might be prompted just out of your instinct to hold the door open so that they can, go all the way through. It's just a matter of etiquette, right? That's part of the norms of our society, and that doesn't apply in every other context. So norms are both context dependent in terms of their geographic location and also in terms of the time in which these norms may exist. So at the individual level, we have lots of examples of norms, but there's also norms at the international level. And just to give you an example, one important norm is that states that sign on to international treaties are obliged to then follow their obligations under that treaty. So it would be improper, a deviation from expected behavior, if countries signed on to international treaties but had no intention of ever following them. So we expect as a norm among states that states, when they sign on to international treaties, will actually abide by the obligations that they've signed on to. Now, the most important norm in the international system is known as sovereignty. And sovereignty is a really important concept because it has helped to identify what makes states so important in the international system and what their role is vis-a-vis each other. So sovereignty, this very important international norm, means that states have the freedom to act as they choose to within their own boundaries, but they also should be free from foreign interference. So no one has a right to tell a state what to do. That's the purview of the state itself to make decisions about what's proper for their society. Although there's definitely some caveats to that, especially when we examine different kinds of international norms. On occasion, there are times in which the international community may agree that what a state is doing internally is not justified under current international norms, so it may warrant some kind of foreign intervention. But generally speaking, sovereignty means freedom to act as you want to within your state and freedom from foreign interference. Another important concept is what's known as the security dilemma. And this means you are protecting your own security, but by doing so, you threaten the security of other states. So think about for a moment the Cold War. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were in this arms race to develop the most sophisticated and largest nuclear arsenal in the world. And the idea is that if you had a larger nuclear arsenal than the other actor, that would prevent the other actor from wanting to strike because you always would have the capability of either responding or of acting first, so you wouldn't want to agitate them. So, but what happened resulting in an arms race is that by virtue of the United States or the Soviet Union increasing the size of its nuclear armament, that caused the other state, either the US or the Soviet Union, to become even less secure because they saw themselves losing to another state that appears to be ramping up its own armament. So in a security dilemma, what you might do as a state to enhance your own security can be viewed externally as a signal that other countries might have to be worried. And so this causes a kind of cyclical behavior where both sides are constantly increasing the size of their military forces or improving their technology, and it throws fear into the hearts of other countries because they feel like they're now being threatened, perhaps indirectly, by the development of additional resources that can be brought to bear in a conflict setting. All right, another important concept is known as the balance of power. And this is when one or more states' power balances that of another state or group of states. And this results in counterbalancing and helps to maintain the stability of the international system. Because if you think about it, kind of like in physics, right? You want the system to be in equilibrium or stasis. So if you have any one state, just use my little scale here for example, right? If you have any one state that has a preponderance of force in the international system, that may weigh the balance of the international system in its favor because it has such a gravitational pull due to all of the military or the soft power that they wield and so forth. But say that that state is counterbalanced by a lot of other states that work together. There you might have a kind of equilibrium emerge in the international system, because then these states together might be as forceful and successful in preserving their own security as this one state is alone. So the argument would be that you have a balance of power occur in sometimes when there's an imbalance in the international system to restore it to a more stable condition. And this is arguably what was going on during the Cold War period, when you had the United States over here, let's say, and its allies allied against the Soviet Union and its allies in the East. And so it was, among other reasons, called the Cold War because it wasn't a hot war in the sense of the United States and the Soviet Union going to war with one another on each other's own territory. Now, there were things called proxy wars, which we'll talk about at a later point, but suffice it to say for the moment, this effort to counterbalance each other led to a relatively stable situation that ultimately did not result in a Third World War. And so this process by which smaller states might join on to the most powerful state because they really have very little to offer it, but are willing to kind of prove their loyalty by virtue of their being strength in numbers, this is called bandwagoning. This is where we see, you'll notice this when countries go to war with one another. Occasionally there will be these really small countries that will provide a more powerful state, just a token number of forces or technology or financial resources. And that's really just a sign of their loyalty to that larger state. And that's kind of part of this phenomenon known as bandwagoning. So you can see this sort of geographically from the time of the Cold War. All the countries that are in blue are the United States and its allies. And that's counterbalanced with the Soviet Union and its allies. And then you also have kind of a looser confederation of communist states, which were at some point perhaps operating as a third wheel, like in the case of China, or were more aligned with the Soviet Union, but not as much as to call themselves a formidable ally. And so this is how the world was really divided for the period from the end of World War II up and through pretty much 1989, 1990. What about the distribution of power? I mentioned several slides ago about the fact that there are different configurations in the structure of the international system. So we're going to look at a few of these different configurations right now. So as I mentioned, neo-realists talk about the structure of the international system. And when they're talking about this, what they mean is the polarity, which is the number of independent power centers in the system. So in a multipolar system, you have many different centers of power. You have, say, one example might be a situation where there are 5 or 6 centers of power, and they're not grouped into alliances. They may occasionally work together with one another, but by and large, they are kind of existing autonomously from one another, and there's many of them that are potentially threatening each other. And we haven't seen that for hundreds of years at this point, but a more common or more recent system is a tripolar system in which there were 3 centers of power. And here, as I mentioned in the previous slide, you can make an argument that from the 1960s through the 1970s, the United States, the Soviet Union, and China functioned as this kind of tripartite system. The one that you are probably most familiar with is the bipolar system, in which there are 2 predominant states in the international system. And this is what we tend to think of when we think of the Cold War, right? The United States and its allies versus the Soviet Union and its allies, but the US and the USSR are really dictating what happens in the international system. And then, of course, there's a unipolar system. And this is one where there is only one center of power, known as the global hegemon. This situation is called a hegemony. And so since the end of the Cold War, one could, again, make an argument that the United States, and indeed scholars did call this the unipolar moment for the US, but now there are scholars who decry the end of the United States' unipolar moment and talk about the fact that US power is on the wane as other countries are beginning to supplant it in terms of their power in the international system. The most common of which that gets mentioned in these kinds of discussions is China, right? But then you also have other countries in the developing world that are important in their own right and that are certainly increasing in their prominence, and those include Russia, India, and Brazil. A really important theory to know that relates to all this is what's called power transition theory. And this says that the largest wars will result when a rising power surpasses the most powerful state. This is because there's a kind of instability in the international system. One state, perhaps like, for example, right now, the United States, appears to be treading water, if not diminishing in its authority in the international system. And a country like China, some scholars and analysts may argue, poses a threat to the prominence of the United States as the lone superpower in the international system. So one theory, or the way that this power transition theory might be actuated in practice, is that you have a situation where the United States, seeing that China seeks to overtake it in the hierarchy of the international system, would engage in a preemptive war to perhaps stop China from being able to realize its potential. That way, the US can restore its position or maintain its position in the international system and maybe stave off some kind of intrusion for a decade or two, or something like that. So this is a theory that we see with great relevance today because people are currently talking about whether there's going to be a kind of war between the United States and China, although for reasons that we will get into in later lectures, there are other aspects of the dynamic between the US-China relationship that suggest maybe war is not in the cards after all. And so this topic of hegemony is important because we have been living, probably for most of us anyway, in a lifetime in which the United States was at the very least probably a regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere, if not something like a global hegemon. So we have seen this before. The United States emerged from World War II as the global hegemon, and in part what was really fascinating about this was the fact that the United States participated obviously in World War II on the side of the Allied powers, and the military theater, the battlefields on which World War II was waged, happened largely over in Europe and some parts of Asia. So the United States had the benefit of not having the battle come to its own shores. So it was in a much better position, at least in terms of its economy and infrastructure, than other countries, especially those out in Europe. And in fact, if you get a chance, if you ever go to Germany, there are relics of the impact that World War II had on the country. In fact, when I was in Berlin, during my study abroad program, there's a tower, a clock tower, that is in pretty much the same condition as it was after it was bombed during World War II, as a kind of testament to what had happened, the kind of the damage to German society, the awful consequences of war on people who live in these places, and it's just kind of a conscious reminder of the impact that the decision to make war has on the people who actually live in the places where war is conducted. Another example is Britain in the 19th century. Britain was the most important naval power, and at that time, he who commanded the seas had the predominant authority in the international system. So these are two examples of where the country could be considered the lone or perhaps most important hegemon in the international system. So there's a theory also associated with this, which relates to stability as well. And this is called the hegemonic stability theory. And the hegemonic stability theory says that the international system is most orderly when there's only one world power. Basically, everyone does what that one power wants it to do. And so there's no question about which country should we follow, what would happen if we go against the wishes of China. Does that mean that they're going to go and engage in warfare with us? If there's only one power, then the directions for what other states should do arguably should be more clear. So other kinds of benefits allegedly that are conferred by a hegemonic position when there's one world power include reducing anarchy, deterring aggression on behalf of other states that might otherwise be encouraged to do so. It promotes free trade. Everyone wants to do trade with the big power, so that may result in the reduction in trade barriers, and then also it may wind up being a global currency because it's a lot easier to trade when everyone uses the same system. So if you have lots of different systems, there's lots of costs that then get added to the process of international trade. So if everyone has operates under a global currency, trade and financial flows become more readily traded and accessible by other countries. So basically, the whole point of hegemonic stability theory is international system becomes much more stable when there's one actor that's dictating the terms of what's appropriate in the global system. And the United States, while it has been arguably a hegemon in the past, it's not as if that one hegemon acts in a monolithic way. So we've seen the US, when it has had a place of prominence in the international system, oscillate between internationalism on the one hand, so playing a very important and strategic role in how international affairs are conducted, leading major diplomatic missions, attending international conferences and that kind of thing, and that's on the one hand. And then isolationism, or retreating from the international system, focusing more on domestic issues. And similarly, the US has also alternated between unilateralism on the one hand, so going and doing things irrespective of what other states might deem appropriate, basically just following what your own instincts, not worrying about what other states think on the one hand, and then multilateralism on the other hand, where the United States engages in acts when it has the support of a larger number of actors, so it's not going at these kinds of issues alone. And so the United States has kind of gone back and forth between these approaches, even though it has had arguably kind of regional hegemonic status for decades now.